Last week, Paradox Interactive gave us an overview about what to expect in the coming months for Victoria 3, and today we're diving into the detail around laws and revolutions. There are a few new mechanics that they're introducing, some map markers, events, and all sorts of stuff. They seem like pretty positive changes, so let's jump in and take a look at what they're planning for Victoria 3's Update 1.3. The focus of this update will be around enacting laws, the politics and revolutions of different interest groups, and everything that surrounds that. They start by saying, hey look, we've identified some problems with the system, and many in the community have identified them as well. You can see them on screen now. I won't read them verbatim, but essentially they're trying to target a few things. Firstly, excessive randomness in how we enact laws. For example, a 5% success chance could potentially, somewhat randomly, land a critical hit and get it passed. Alternatively, bad rolls and unsuccessful rolls at the start of a game can potentially screw over your entire politics and force you to re-roll the same law again and again until you have slightly more favorable odds. The other focus here is around disarming revolutions and how revolutions form. And there's some really interesting detail that we'll get into in a little bit about interest groups being brought into government, previously exploited by the player as an easy way to get out of a revolution. But also these interest groups develop a bit more agency, I would argue, in this update. They can leave a government in protest, and maybe you'll have to sweeten the deal in another way. Before we get into the new mechanics surrounding it, let's first take a look at what they're changing around law enactment, moving from a system of excessive randomness and towards one that has some clearer steps involved. In Victoria 3's 1.3, laws need to progress through 3 new phases: the introduction, the consideration, and finally their adoption. They're not changing, however, the underlying mechanics: success, advance, debate, and stall. These mechanics are, of course, already in the game and will largely determine how quickly a law progresses, if it progresses at all. They also address the downward spiral, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The key change here is that when you roll a successful outcome instead of debate or stall, you'll progress to the next phase. Again, introduction, consideration, and adoption, instead of just immediately passing the law. If you achieve success in that third and final phase, of course, the adoption phase, then the law will be passed. To compensate for the extra time requirements that are obviously going to be involved in the system, which now essentially has 3 steps instead of 1, they've changed the pace of the enactment clock, i.e. how quickly laws can pass. They argue it'll mean there are more twists and turns during each law enactment phase, and they make a special note to say that previously it wasn't uncommon if you had, say, a 40% endorsement of a law that you wanted to pass, you might just succeed on the very first checkpoint. Boom, bing bam, done. Which makes the whole thing mostly just a waiting experience, requiring a number of successes. They can compensate for that randomness factor and arguably create more interesting challenges. An important note: if you get an event that, say, gives you a plus 5% enactment chance, that will play through each and every stage, effectively giving you a 5% bonus to all 3 of them, a much bigger deal than it could have been. You're also more likely to experience a variety of events before the enactment is concluded, and I believe, we'll get to it in a minute, but I think they're adding around 40 new events to accompany this. Another underlying theme of what they're trying to do here is remove some of the ways that players could gamify the system and potentially exploit it, and you can see that in the example here. Events spawned by the enactment process are now characterized or categorized in association with a new UI element that tracks their progress, identifies the outcome that spawned to give us more context. They will also time out automatically when the clock fills up, so there's always one enactment event pending, and no more delaying taking action on negative ones until the cycle rolls through to try and improve your outcome. So a slight tweak there that might make things just a little bit more difficult. Another issue on the chopping block, and this one will be more favorable, I'm sure, is that in the current build of Victoria 3, if you get some negative events, right? Let's say you get a minus 10% and then some population group gets angry with you, you take another minus 10%, you can effectively snowball to 0 and be stuck there forever. The lower the enactment chance, the lower the chance of getting a positive event as well. So it turns into what they call a self-perpetuating cycle of digging a deeper and deeper hole. The correct action, of course, as players is to just ditch it, right? If your enactment chance was at 0 or very near to it, just cancel the law and come back to it a little bit later. To address that issue, they've introduced a concept called setbacks, which can be taken to recover from a situation where you're spiraling out of control. Each enactment process can take up to 3 setbacks, so 3 strikes and you're out. And when it has taken its third, it will automatically and irrevocably fail. Again, 3 strikes, you're out. For as long as you have less than that, events will permit you to reset your chance of the enactment process if you've taken too large of a hit, or in some cases, you can trade a setback to turn a negative outcome into a slightly more positive one. And this is really key, because if we are allowed to essentially reset the bill at Parliament, you know what, we're just going to try again, this allows us to retry without having to stand down a law for, I believe at the moment, 2 years. So there's an opportunity even for a really failing piece of legislation to be turned around using the new stall and enactment process. Another quick but important note is that many of the law enactment events have been backfilled with new options. So you can choose to take one of these setbacks that we were just talking about before in return for avoiding a more negative repercussion, letting you sort of gamble a bit to try and get the bill passed. And in the event that they show, you're taking a minus 10% enactment time, so it's going to take longer to get this thing through. However, you will pick up an extra chance of success at 5%. Despite the new setback mechanic, it is still possible that you might find yourself in a situation where enacting a law is so difficult that it's not worth your time. This is perhaps a frequent memory for Victoria 3 players. When you cancel an enactment in 1.3, you'll find that the cooldown has increased to 2 years instead of 1. Apologies, it's increased to 2 years, and it's applied even if you have not reached the first checkpoint. But also an entirely new effect. If there's a political movement, a group of your population rallying behind this cause, agitating until the law passes, and you say, nah, we're not going to do that, sorry, then the movement's radicalism will shoot up considerably, in many cases all but guaranteeing a revolt as a result. Interesting. So we could potentially see more political turbulence here if we're not managing our population's needs and desires properly. We also have a screenshot here. It's captioned, "Cancellation confirmation box explaining the impact of your decision. Laws redacted to not spoil the fun for next week's dev diary, but feel free to speculate in the comments." And you can see there's a whole load of laws. They've all been redacted, though you can see their images on the left, the top one being a plant with an eyeball. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what they might be in the comments below. But importantly, inside of the tooltip, you can see that by not doing it, it's adding plus 30 political movement radicalism, quite a significant jump. Instead of an AI artwork break today, I'd like to thank these legends you can see on screen. Thank you to all 46 of you for your continued support, whether you've been a YouTube channel member for 22 months or joined 6 days ago. It seriously means the world. So what's all this meant to achieve, and how does it relate to another new mechanic? Well, they argue it closes the door on 2 exploits. Starting to enact a law a movement demands, but cancelling it before it succeeds, keeping the movement just sort of teetering on the edge of revolution, 92%, 93%, and then leaving it there without giving any thought. And it also cancels the previous exploit around cancelling enactment just before the first enactment cycle is up, avoiding cooldown penalties altogether. But what about that other exploit? Where, for example, if you had a revolutionary interest group, you could invite them into your government and completely remove their political movement. They argue in one sense it's working as designed, inviting in a populist faction to execute their politics in a more respectable fashion is not infrequently utilised tool for declawing a movement. The problem in Victoria 3, they argue, is that us, the human players, assuming You're not an AI, will be in full control of which laws are enacted, so inviting a group into government doesn't actually give them any more power. It just cancels their political movement, and then you could just leave them sitting there. It only takes away their ability to threaten consequences. To address this, they're introducing a new mechanic called government petitions. And here you can see an example on screen. The armed forces will expect the government to pass professional army within the next 5 years. Petition events commonly appear after the first few months of forming a government. So maybe you've just brought in an interest group that wasn't particularly happy with you. Now they will be able to petition the government. They can be issued by any interest groups in government and for any of the law changes that they endorse the most. And I like this because it seems to be adding a little bit more flavor to each interest group, helping to separate them, but also, of course, ultimately allowing them to press their demands and stopping us from simply suppressing what they want. They're interlacing this new mechanic through journal entries and legitimacy. The event itself produces a journal entry that, of course, you can choose to enact and pursue or not. Passing the desired law will, of course, improve the interest group's approval of you, as you would expect. But it will also improve the legitimacy of your government for a long time, as you've shown that you are a responsive governor. On the other hand, if you don't pass the law, or somehow disenfranchise the group, they will become very disappointed in you. I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. They argue that this effectively creates a sort of government agenda, where us as players, we're rewarded for pursuing and penalised for ignoring. Further incentivizing building a government constellation of groups where politics you actually want, whose politics you want. And I think that does kind of speak to the broader theme of this dev diary. Finally, they ask, what happens when things go sideways? Your population demands something that you can't or perhaps won't give them. In the current build, a political movement with a high level of radicalism will become revolutionary, triggering a countdown until they rise up against you, taking one or several of your states with them, and of course, all of the military, etc. that resides within. In 1.3, the fundamentals remain, but the countdown itself has changed drastically, and we'll be able to see it on the map. Cue a new feature, the revolution clock. When a movement becomes revolutionary, the clock begins to tick. Similar to the enactment clock for our laws, every time it fills up, the revolution meter will generally increase, with a revolution event triggering alongside of it. The event frequently provides options for us on how we might want to deal with that revolution, and in total, as I mentioned earlier, there are 40 such events in 1.3. Many of them are contextually triggered based on who's supporting the revolution and, of course, what law you're trying to enact and things like that. Here they show an example. With the support of rural folk and a movement led by the intelligentsia and trade unions, all of them individually quite weak, they're attempting to ban slavery in early game Afghanistan. The reaction from landowners was, as you can imagine, quite severe. Not only did they leave the government in protest, I like that, causing legitimacy to drop to a level where we can't make any progress on the law, but they also started their own movement to preserve debt slavery. On account of their considerable strength, they went straight into plotting a revolution against their former rural co-workers, a proper divide within government where an interest group has taken not just their interest, but also their legitimacy and their political power with them. And as you can see here on the new political movement panel, we get a fairly good overview of where their support is actually coming from and why they are as strong and radical as they are. In this case, thanks to a ruler trait, a little bit from supporting radicals and largely from angry supporting interest groups. There are other ways, of course, to appease a political movement or interest group. Perhaps you can't give them what they want, but there might be some other low-hanging fruit you could bribe them with. On the Supporting Pops tab in the same panel, you can find out exactly who's providing the support of radicalism in the movement. Perhaps, they say, you could temper some of these strong feelings by increasing dividends in their industries, or providing some targeted reduction in prices of their certain luxury goods. So maybe you don't want to cave with their specific demand, but you might want to sweeten the deal in other ways. Here they give us another taste around these new events or more dynamic events. The revolution clock events usually adjust the revolutionary process up or down, as you would expect, but they can also apply other conditions, some which may upset a country's overall political balance for quite some time. Of course, also ultimately impacting the revolutionary progression indirectly, as the clout of a group heavily impacts the conditions of a movement. In this particular event, you can see by standing someone down, you will get failures of judgment for 2 years, losing interest group attraction for that group and popularity. And remember earlier when I mentioned there'd be something extra on the map? I am generally a fan of displaying these things on the map, and I think that Victoria 3 could perhaps embrace this not just in what we're talking about today around laws and enactment, but also in other areas such as the military. Revolutionary movements have also been given their own animated map marker to make it clear where the revolution is brewing and what territory is likely to go along with it when it explodes, so what you're going to lose. And once again, they've had to redact part of the UI to not spoil some of the surprises in store. Here again, likely talking about those laws that were redacted earlier. They conclude by saying, as you can see, we're putting a lot of focus on making internal politics more dynamic and fun to play. And there's much more to come with subsequent dev diaries. Next week, Victoria will present new laws, those redacted ones we might have looked at earlier. Again, let me know what you think below, that they've introduced into the mix to fill some of the late game gaps and enable new early and mid game conflicts between political factions. What do you reckon? Will this make the revolutionary system better? Will it make it more enjoyable for the player? I think it certainly adds an element of realism to it. And of course, I also agree where they say it will make groups more dynamic. Being able to push their demands on a government through new mechanics is a great way to see that play out. Thanks very much for joining me today, everybody. I'll see you next time.